Hello, friends. This is another in the series of Divine Mother in Nature talks, and I wanted to address a particular thought that occurred to me from working outside in our yard, but it applies to all of nature and it applies to our own lives as well. So we have an apple tree just outside of our front door, which is over the years that we've lived in Sacramento has grown quite large, sometimes in spite of my efforts to prune it down to a slightly more manageable level. It has a mind of its own. It wants to be a certain height, and there's not a lot I can do about it, it seems, to prevent it from being that height. So I've sort of given up on that idea. But anyway, this year was a bumper crop, relatively speaking, of apples. I mean, I spent pretty much an entire day in the tree, either on a ladder or literally climbing in the tree to reach apples that I couldn't reach from the ladder because the tree is getting broad enough that it's really hard to reach inside of it. And in harvesting all these, I don't know, probably 150 pounds of apples, something, a significant quantity. It occurred to me, it reminded me of a book that I had read years ago, The Botany of Desire, which literally talks about apple trees in particular, but in a more general way. One of the themes described in that book is how the gardens that we plant, the orchards that we plant, we think we're the ones in charge of them. But in fact, the apple tree has a certain mind of its own. It wants to propagate. It wants to be desired. It wants to be wanted, because in so doing, we'll carry those apples far away, and trees will result from the apple seeds that will get left in the ground or eaten by squirrels or whatever it may be. And the thought that struck me in all of this is that, there have been years, like last year, it seems to me, pandemic year, which seemed kind of thin. I mean, it's still kind of a pandemic year, but last year was really a pandemic year. I don't know that we got a single apple from that tree. It was just like, where have they all gone? I mean, squirrels got whatever was there, and maybe we got one or two apples. I mean, it really wasn't much. But anyway, this year was swung the opposite way. And it just struck me that everything in nature, and this tree this year in particular, produced this abundance of apples. I mean, I feel like we fed half the neighborhood of raccoons and squirrels and people with this enormous abundance of apples. But everything in nature is not only providing for itself in the sense of, like the apple, trying to propagate its seed, if you can think of an apple as having that mind. But I mean, in a sense, you have to say nature creates this impetus to keep the thing moving. The apple tree isn't going to live forever. I mean, there are apple trees that live more than 100 years, but their production slows down and eventually they die. And sooner or later, if that tree if that species is going to keep on going, it needs to be going someplace else. And how that thought applies to our lives, it occurs to me, and obviously I was describing just a tree, but I mean, even things that don't seem to have something that would be productive. I was reading recently an article that I've read this before, but recently again was the thought put out that we shouldn't rake our leaves, or at least not rake them entirely. I mean, if there's such an abundance of leaves that they mat up on top of the grass, they will eventually kill the grass if you just leave them there that way. But if you leave some of the leaves or shred them up with a lawnmower so that they're kind of dispersed and, a light sprinkling of them, the leaves provide food for a whole lot of little bugs that the birds then eat. That, there's a little ecosystem that's happening right on top of the grass. And the leaves provide that. And we want to bag them up, burn them, cart them away, get them out of there because the grass looks so nice and it seems sort of unkempt or something looking if you leave everything all covered with leaves. And that thought that everything provides for something else, doesn't just provide for itself, but for something else, someone else, some other process, leads me back to our own lives and a natural question. What do I provide? What can I provide? And of course, we can provide a smile. It doesn't cost us anything. We can provide a supportive energy. So have you ever been in a conversation where there's 3 or 4 people talking and maybe you're standing listening and don't really have an active role in the conversation, but you know that if you leave, the conversation will end or it will change dramatically. And your presence is feeding energy into the conversation, even if you don't say anything. And if that energy is a positive one, then everyone feels nice in your presence. And it's a very real thing. It's not something that can necessarily be measured, on some electronic scale. But people will know if they feel comfortable in your presence. And that's something that can be provided. And it's not, people don't get paid, huge salaries to be comfortable to be around necessarily. Although, if you think about it, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors of all kind get paid significant amounts of money for people to be able to talk to them and to provide a sounding board and perhaps some advice. But that process of talking to and being listened to is an incredibly helpful and supportive thing. And so I'll close just simply by asking that question. What do we provide, or what do we offer willingly, lovingly, supportively to the universe around us? And just take that question home with you in your meditation or in your heart or however you feel, to be answered, not in a challenging way, not like, oh, you must do more than what you're doing or whatever, but just to simply hold that question up in the light and see what answer comes, and possibly see what other answer may come, like, oh yes, I would enjoy doing this other thing, or it would be lovely too. Because often the things that we perceive the world to be in need of, in a surprising way, we're often able to provide a little of that ourselves if we will willingly do so. And we can often catalyze the more of it in the world by offering whatever little we may have to offer. So you might just take those thoughts and questions into your own heart and life and see what answers come to you. Namaste.